Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And this lecture is part of the ongoing series on the English poetry in 20th century. And today, what we are discussing is, the poems of Toni Morrison. And I know that when we, so the lecture is titled Toni Morrison, 5 Poems 2002. Now, I know that the moment we hear this name, Toni Morrison, what comes to our mind is fiction, right? Because she is primarily a novelist. And maybe for most of you, you may not even be aware that she has also written poetry, right? But even though it is just one poetry collection that she wrote, in her entire career. But we know that how Morrison, is a writer of immense repute, an African American. So it's interesting to then also see that what experiments does she do when she writes poetry, how does she express her thoughts, what themes are part of her poems as well. So Toni Morrison was born in 1931 and was around just until the other day, that is in 2019, and she's an American novelist. She was born and raised in Ohio. Now you see, in 1955, she earned a master's degree from Cornell University. In fact, she was also the first black female editor for fiction at Random House in New York City in 1960s. Now we notice that how Morrison was actually credited with many firsts. She's an important voice in the African American fiction, while at the same time, in the literary scene, we notice that, apart from her education, apart from her role as a writer, even as, her role as an editor, she has made a seminal contribution. So she was the first black female editor for fiction at Random House in New York City in the 1960s. In 1970s onwards, she was an editor, as we just discussed, at Random House. She also won the Pulitzer Prize for her 1987 novel Beloved, and also won a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1933. Now you will see on your screens, Toni Morrison. We have seen her in, I'm sure, a lot of references. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970, and it was actually developed from a short story which she wrote about a black woman desiring blue eyes. You see, what we're going to do is to just understand that what literary background does Morrison come from, and how even her poems were also shaped by that literary sensibility. So when she writes the Bluest Eye, we see that she's talking about a very peculiar experience, that is, of a black person or a black woman desiring blue eyes. And we all know that blue eyes is a feature of Caucasian people, that is, people with white skin. So we notice that, she wrote a story around this, which then captures the desire of, one can say, a kind of a, an innocence of an individual desiring a certain physical features, which probably, are considered to be more accepting in a white dominated society. Now it is believed that she wrote the novel getting up at 4 a.m. daily while she was also raising her children. Now you see, this also tells us about the resilience that she had as an individual, that despite having a family and other responsibilities, she was still committed to her work. That's how she wrote her first novel, being up early, putting her thoughts on paper in the form of a novel. And this book was reviewed in the New York Times by John Leonard, who wrote about her writing style, and this is what he had to say. He says, and I quote, "A prose so precise, so faithful to speech, and so charged with pain and wonder that the novel becomes poetry. But the bluest eye is also history, sociology, folklore, nightmare, and music." Unquote. So this, with this review, we get a sense of what kind of a writer that she was. Her novel was actually charged with pain and wonder. But you see over here, the reviewer also says that the novel becomes poetry. So you see how sometimes her writing is so powerful that it seems to even transcend genres, right? So likewise, her other works of prose include Sula, which was written in 1975. That was a novel about friendship between two black women. Then there was this other novel called Song of Solomon, published in 1977, about the life of African American man from birth to death. Then in 1981, she wrote the novel Tar Baby, which was about a fashion model who falls in love with a man with no money but who is at ease with being black. And of course, there were various other texts in between. And then in 2002, which is early 21st century, came her only and the first collection of poetry that is called Five Poems. And this collection of poetry is going to be in discussion today, where we are going to look at two poems from this collection, right? But before we do that, let us also further understand what are the concerns that are central to Toni Morrison's writing. Foremost, we've seen that how she stood for the experience and the voice of the blacks or the African Americans, right? The question of dignity, the question of desire, the question of love, the question of identity, all of these were quite central to her works, right? And we also notice that in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Morrison talks about language a lot. And the way she talks about language in her speech also gives us a very particular insight into her way of approaching themes and also different issues around her. So the first thing that she said in her speech was, and I quote, language, she talks of language as susceptible to death, erasure, certainly imperiled and salvageable only by an effort of the will, unquote. So the foremost thing that she points towards is that how language is susceptible to death, which means that there are moments when language can become maybe inert. She also uses the word erasure. It means that language is not able to convey what it is supposed to convey. It carries a lot of, it can be obscured. The message that is supposed to, be communicated can deliberately be silenced. That is what she means by erasure, right? And having acknowledged these truths, she says that it is salvageable only by an effort of the will. It means she's highlighting or she's talking about the will and the action of the individual in order to consciously take language away from this possibility of erasure. Now, what kind of a erasure, what kind of a death is she talking about with respect to language will be made clearer as we look at the second quote by her from her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. She says, and I quote, "A dead language is not only one no longer spoken or written. It is unyielding language, content to admit its own paralysis. Like statist language, censored and censoring." So what does she say? Now this is of course a longish quote and we'll break it down for discussion. So in this first segment, what she says is that a dead language is that which, if it is censored, right, it is no longer, it does not point towards this reality, that there is a silencing of this fact, that when there is censoring, when there is control of language and nothing is done or said about it, then according to Morrison, language dies. So which means what? That for Morrison, language is a means to talk about difficult truths, right? And if it is censored, that is the and there's no questioning on that censorship, then that's the beginning of the death of the language, right? Then moving on, she says, ruthless in its political duties, it has no desire or purpose other than maintaining the free range of its own narcotic narcissism, its own exclusivity and dominance. It actively thwarts the intellect, stalls conscience, suppresses human potential. Now, these are all the points that she makes about a language that is censored, right? That when language is censored, what does it entail, right? It kind of perpetuates exclusivity and dominance. What do we mean by that? That it only starts to carry the viewpoints of just a few people, right? And therefore, it becomes a way to establish the dominance of that group of people. That's why she goes on to say it actively thwarts the intellect. Thwarts means it hinders intellect. It interferes in the open use of the intellect. It stalls the conscience. Stalls means it stops conscience. It suppresses human potential. So if language is censored, all of this happens. The intellect suffers, the conscience is silenced, and human potential is suppressed. Unreceptive to interrogation, it cannot form or tolerate new ideas, shape other thoughts that tell another story, fill baffling silences, unquote. So she says that a language which is censored is unreceptive to interrogation. Means what? That there can be no questions put to the reality that this language is representing. It cannot tolerate new ideas. Now look at the language that she is using. Look at the vocabulary. It cannot tolerate new ideas, shape other thoughts, or tell another story. And that is when a language dies. When it is censored, it leads to all these consequences. Now you see, this is a very, very powerful message that she gives in her Nobel acceptance speech. This then tells us what? That Morrison, as a creative writer, as a novelist, and briefly, of course, also a poet, believes in using language for the purpose of telling another story. Another story, what does she imply? Of telling or talking about those truths which are not often discussed in the mainstream, right? Talking about those people who are not sufficiently represented or maybe misrepresented, right? Fill the baffling silences. To talk about those things which are either deliberately silenced or not talked about at will. So for Morrison, these are the ways that language, or these are the purposes that language serves. Now, I'm sure, understanding or getting to know this aspect of Morrison's thought, next time when we read either her fiction or her poetry, it's going to, we're going to make a special note of how is she using language, right? What are the alternate stories is she telling us through them? What are the other silences that she's, trying to fill with this expression, right? And then, she goes on to say that we die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language, and that may be the measure of our lives. Unquote. Now, this is another very, very powerful quotation from her Nobel acceptance speech. She's saying that we die, and that shows that there's life, right? So death is, one of the moments where we are forced to acknowledge the presence of life, right? But she says we do language, and that may be the measure of our lives. Now, this is a very, very big statement that she makes, that how language is the measure of someone's of our lives, which means what? That the way we use language tells us a lot about our lives, right? The depth of the language tells us about the measure of our lives. The issues or the concerns that the language is used in order to address also discuss or also bring to the fore the relevance of our lives. So you see, at the center of her works really is this understanding of language, which is enabling, right? So if we see, if we go back and do a recap of all that we have gathered about Toni Morrison so far, first is that she was a 20th and the 21st century writer, primarily a novelist, but she has also written one collection of poetry as well. Second, we saw that how she is, she was awarded the Pulitzer. She's also a Nobel laureate, and for a significant aspect of her life, she was also an editor. Third, we discussed that how the issues of the blacks, their identity, their experience, were central to her aesthetic, right? Fourth, and very importantly, we discussed that how language is very, very crucial to her aesthetic. And we understood her approach to language, where according to her, language must not be censored, right? Because if it is censored, it suppresses the human potential. It thwarts the intellect, right? And language becomes, for Morrison, that means which introduces new ideas, which tells different stories or alternate stories, and also which fills silences, right? So these are some of the important aspects for us to understand about the literary background of Toni Morrison. And in the next part of the lecture, we're going to discuss the poetry collection that is in discussion today, and we're also going to look at some of the poems by her. Thank you.